Well, folks, he finally did it. I believe last night, but either way, over this weekend, Nicholas J. Fuentes, the Mexican child leader of the white race, has formally declared holy war on the Jews. And this is now the second day in a row that I have seen his name trending on Twitter. Unfortunately, alongside Ethan Ralph. I don't know if I'm going to get into Ralph. I'm not up on the latest Ralphamale drama, and honestly, I do my best to ignore Ethan Ralph. I guess he doxed some of Fuentes' friends, but really, if you've got a secret online identity, and Ethan Ralph knows who you are, you're already fucked. Okay? You had to have known this is coming. You can't be too surprised. If you let Ethan Ralph know your name, or if he had access to that kind of information, it was going to come out at some point. So, what is it that Fuentes actually said? Well, he gave this speech, and the audio quality was terrible. I guess his mic was turned off, and so there was just sort of like an ambient mic or something. That it did not sound like it was the microphone that he was speaking into that was actually working for this big clip that's being thrown around of him talking about how, you know, the Jews at war with us, and how if they want a war, they've got one, and they're going to die in the war, and we're all going to die in the war, and it's very fire and brimstone. And folks are very concerned. And honestly, at this point, I've never been someone who's particularly concerned with what Nick Fuentes has to say. But I do somewhat understand people, drawing a line at this and saying, hey, he's crossed a line, and this is getting kind of dangerous. He's got his followers. He always has. His fan base is very loyal. They're very passionate. And I agree. I think he's a good speaker. I understand why there are people who watch him. He can be entertaining. Personally, I've never really been able to watch much of him, like even just to try and understand him, because for one thing, he's never on time for his own show. So if I've ever gone out of my way to try and actually listen to him to say, hey, I wonder what Nicholas J. Fuentes has to say about X issue, and then you try and actually tune into his show, he's never there. He shows up at like 10 o'clock for an 8 o'clock show. And then with all the censorship over the years, he's not around as much as he used to be. I used to see him a lot on Twitter. Not anymore, not in quite some time. Although he was there suspiciously long, considering all the other people who had been banned. It did seem quite interesting to me that Fuentes was left up and that his account was intact for so long. Eventually, they did whack him, but it took a very long time. I mean, he was not even on YouTube for quite a long while, and his YouTube streams used to do decently well every night. But then there's all the confusion ever since he went to his own platform. There's a question about how many of the viewers are actually real, whether or not there's an algorithm that artificially inflates the view count, and even if you assume that's not true, he doesn't appear to be taking over the world, at least not anytime soon. So why care if he says inflammatory things? Lots of people say inflammatory things. Louis Farrakhan has said inflammatory things since the 60s. Nothing's ever really come of it. I mean, sure, there's been a couple of people who are followers of Louis Farrakhan who have committed terrorist attacks, but in the grand scheme of things, has that really amounted to much? Is Louis Farrakhan really a big danger to my safety or the safety of, the group of people who he hates, the white man? No, I don't really feel threatened by Louis Farrakhan. I find him kind of funny, actually. I find him entertaining in some of the same ways that I find Fuentes entertaining. So I don't think I'm biased. I don't think I'm biased in favor of ignoring Nick Fuentes and not feeling threatened by him just because I'm not a Jew, and it's like, well, of course you don't feel threatened. You're a whitey just like Fuentes. But I also have a bit of an issue with this whole idea that, the Jews aren't white. You know, the Jews like to be white when it's convenient, and they like to be not white when it isn't convenient. And now, since Fuentes has declared holy war against them, even though most Jews in America, you can even hardly call them Jews since they don't really believe in their religion at all. They're just like, well, I'm an ethnic Jew, which is a nice way of saying, you know, I'm obnoxious and I have an ugly accent, but I don't really believe in all that God crap. It's like, I mean, could you imagine something, you know, someone who's like a third generation atheist? You know, they were an atheist, their parents were atheists, but, you know, my grandpa used to go to church, you know, not every Sunday, but like 2 to 3 weeks out of the month, he'd go to church, so I'm a Christian. Yeah, that really is what passes for a Jew in the West these days. And so as I listen to Nick Fuentes quoting the Talmud, I just have to think that, you know, if there are any Jews hearing him, the vast majority of them have never even heard any of the stuff he's reading. Because they've probably never set foot in a synagogue. And if they did, it might have been on Passover, and it was because they were trying to essentially, like, virtue signal their Judaism. But they don't actually want to go along with the tenets of the religion because that's problematic. Even in Israel, you got a lot of Jews there who don't give a damn about the Torah, or as we would call it, the Old Testament. And so I fail to see what relevance the Talmud would have to them. And so at the end of the day, I think that Fuentes' concern with Jewish people, you know, ruining all of our lives and oppressing us, is overblown, not in the sense that, you know, the specific people who are in power, who he is, you know, questioning. Not that those people are good and that, you know, we should, you know, bow down to them, but that I don't see the common thread as being their remote association with a religion practiced by their ancestors. Now, sure, in the cases of some of them, of course, some of them practice their religion. But that's, in my experience, it's just, you know, it's like saying that, you know, oh, sure, there's a lot of people who go to church on Easter. Are they really Christians? No. Have they ever read the Bible? No. They're like Tucker Carlson was until this year. Apparently, I was listening to Tucker over the weekend. He was talking about how, you know, hey, I'm reading the Bible for the first time. And, you know, because I was an Episcopalian and, you know, we never used the Bible in church. We never read from it or anything. There's all this stuff in there. It's like, wow, you know, this is a pretty good book. Why doesn't anybody talk about this? They have that problem in Judaism times like 1 million. And so if the issue is with traditional Jewish religious law, practices, and beliefs, I just don't see, I don't see how that's relevant to our modern problems. I think a much more straightforward explanation for the actions of people in positions of power who harm Americans is that they are greedy, powerful people, and that they have nothing but contempt for the average American, and they want to amass more power for themselves, more wealth for themselves, by any means necessary. And it's not just greed; they do have an ideology, but I don't see the links between. I don't see how, like, Klaus Schwab and what's another good example of someone who actually is like a thinking person? I keep thinking of strawmen like Joe Biden. I don't want to cite him. Anyway, I don't really want to get into this. I know that that's kind of a cop-out. You know, I open the can of worms and then I say, you know what, I don't want to open that can of worms, you know, 10 minutes into the video. But I actually am here somewhat defending him, in that I do think that the moral panic about old Nicholas J is overblown. going back to the example of Louis Farrakhan, Louis Farrakhan has been spewing anti-white hatred for much longer than I've ever been alive, yet I don't walk out in the streets, worrying for myself that a Farrakhan supporter is going to come up and murder me, and that, anti-white assassinations are going to explode, and that there's going to be a white genocide, just because Farrakhan is saying lots of nasty things about the white man. And so I would say the same in the case of Nick Fuentes. I think it's overblown for people to think, oh my gosh, this is so terrible, because now there's going to be a genocide against Jewish people because Nick Fuentes doesn't like the Jews. It's like, well, we don't see that with other ethnic groups. We do not see that with the many, with all the anti-white hatred spewed in this country. And guess what? There's a lot more white people to kill than there are Jews. You could kill a lot more white people before you actually start making a dent in our population. Yet, to my knowledge, racial assassinations of white folks, they do happen, certainly. It happens all the time. There's a lot of murder in this country every year, but it's not my top concern. I do not walk out in the street every day and wonder, is today the day that an anti-white terrorist is going to gun me down? And so Jews shouldn't feel that way either about people who hate Jews. And you should say the same of the blacks. There are always people who feel prejudiced towards certain other groups in society. And you're never going to get rid of all of them. As long as there are any distinctions between people, there are going to be people who have problems with different kinds of people who are dissimilar from themselves. Is a natural part of the human experience. If there were no Jews in America and there were no blacks in America, if we were all so-called white or one of the other races, guess what? We would find internal divisions to hate each other over. There would be a certain subset of the population that would absolutely hate Germans, something like that. People of German descent. Obviously, there's not many literal Germans in America. There aren't really people speaking German, just like there aren't people really speaking Yiddish or Hebrew anymore. It does happen, especially the liturgical language. But there was a time in this country where you had, anti-German hatred because of World War I. And I don't think it's healthy for people of German descent to be walking around thinking, oh my gosh, is today the day that I get killed by an anti-German extremist? So anyway, considering that our government is funding literal Nazis in Ukraine, full-blown, not people who, let's just kind of call them Nazis because they're not fond of Jews. No, people with swastika tattoos, zig-heiling up and down, goose-stepping through their capital. Those are the people who we're supporting. If there really was concern about a rise of so-called anti-Semitism, which of course, anti-Semitism is only ever applied to Jews, it doesn't apply to other Semitic peoples. There's other Semitic groups. I don't understand why this term anti-Semitism, like they talk about Arabs being anti-Semitic. It's like, Arabs are Semites. Please, it's an assault on the English language. If you have an Arab that doesn't like Jews, you call him an Arab that doesn't like Jews. He's not an anti-Semite. He doesn't hate himself. In the past, there were people in Europe who hated Jews because they looked at Jews as a Semitic race and not as a European race. And so that you could call anti-Semitism. But that's a very specific subset of Jew hatred. So anyway, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.